Hey guys, the Simulator here, and here is that long-promised Tactica on how to use high magic. High magic, as I said in my recent overall lore review, is insanely complicated to use correctly and requires you to really unlock how it needs to be used. And the way to use it is definitely not just cast every spell, swap it to whatever lore you needed that turn, and hope it works out, because then you'll end up with about 5 different spells from 5 different lores, all of which you got a turn after you actually needed them. So I'm going to go through and talk about the steps that you should be doing in each game to make sure you get the most out of High Magic Lore Tribute, and then give some examples on what that process should lead you to against certain armies and things like that. And then finally, talk about the different spells and what each one should be used to maximize its potential. Okay, first off, the next couple slides are just like a step-by-step walking through a game and what you need to do at each step in the game to really use high magic. The first two things you need to do is you need to pick a single target lore that you're going to swap almost all your spells to. So it's going to be one you want 3 or 4 useful spells, but more importantly than that, you want them all to be buffs and hexes. You don't want to swap to a lore with a bunch of magic missiles and direct damage spells, because by the time you get your full complement of spells in that lore, it'll be turn 4, turn 5, maybe turn 3 if you're lucky. So most likely everything will be in combat, so if you swap to lore fire, you won't have much you can do. The 4 lores that are most likely to help in that regard are Life, Light, Death, and Shadow. Which one you swap to is dependent on what type of army you have and what army you're facing, obviously. The second thing you need to do once you figure out what the most important lore is figure out the one spell that's the most important, the one that you need to keep swapping spells to that lore until you get. For example, if you have an all-Saurus army and you want it to swap to Light, you're going to want to swap until you get Speed of Light. If you want to swap to Life, until you get Flesh to Stone, etc., etc. Then finally, outside of that one lore, you need to pick a single signature spell that you need against whatever army you're facing. Now, what usually ends up happening is that the lore, your target lore, is meant to help your army, so that's more dependent on what army list you're running. For example, I usually run Heavy Saurus, so I almost always am swapping to Light, except against certain matchups. Meanwhile, the single signature spell, the needed one, is completely dependent on who you are facing. It's almost never going to be the same from game to game, unless obviously you're facing 2 similar armies. But this is things like, oh, I'm facing a steam tank and some demigryphs, let me pick up Searing Doom. Oh, I'm facing vampire counts, let me Spirit Leech the general so they crumble. Skaven, Spirit Leech's general. Troll Horde, oh, I need a fireball, things like that. Now, the tricky thing with trying to decide these 3 is oftentimes your first gut reaction to pick your lore and pick your signature spell will end up having overlap, and you won't think of another signature spell or something. For example, one of the signature spell you need against Skaven is obviously Spirit Leech, because Skaven are very dependent on their general's leadership, and they'll all panic off the board if you manage to kill the general. However, if you don't really think through it, Death is actually going to be your target lore against Skaven, often or not, because again, they're so leadership dependent, and you can really throw Doom and Darkness around and really do a number on them. So it ends up that you want to pick a different signature spell, like, I don't know, Wissen's Wild, maybe Wissen's Wild Form. What I meant to say, though, was Malakoth's Miasma is the best signature spell I would pick against Skaven, because having my target lore be Death, I have Purple Sun, often or not, and Skaven are decent initiative, so I can use miasma to lower their initiative and then throw a purple sun at them. So, it's a little bit more complicated, but once you really get used to it, you can be like, oh, I'm facing a night bus, this is what lore I want, this is what signature spell I want, and this is probably the hardest part to get used to. Okay, and then once you get into the game and you have your target lore and your target signature in mind, the first turn you're going to want to use all your dice and just cast a bunch of 2 and 3 dice spells like Tempest and Forging, Walk Between Worlds, maybe Hand of Glory. Little things like that you can nickel and dime through just to get as many spells off as possible. Because the first turn and the second turn are when you're going to get the majority of your swaps, so you want to get as many swaps as possible. Now I usually would take my first swap and swap it for the signature that I need, even if I only get one swap this first turn, simply because there's a reason that I picked that I needed that signature. Like, I need to Spirit Leech the General, I need to Searing Doom the Steam Tank before it hits my Saurus bus. Things like that. And then you want to take any other spells that you were able to cast and swap them off to your target lore. This first turn, you should not really be casting any high magic spells that you are going to want later in the game. It should definitely just be spells that you cast once and are done with. The Tempest and Arcane Forging are probably the two best examples of that. Alright, then the second and third magic phases, you're going to be casting that signature that you swap to, because, there's a reason you swap to it turn 1. And then this is when you want to be casting the little spells in high magic that are decent, but for whatever reason might not be as good as what you're swapping to. For example, if you're swapping everything to light, well, Hand of Glory is only really useful as a ballistic skill buff, so I usually end up casting it on my Stegodon to get the blowpipe buff, and then swapping it to light, because light has better initiative buffs than Hand of Glory. Apotheosis, if you're swapping everything to life, is almost entirely useless, because its effect is the lore attribute of life. So the first thing you need to heal, you cast Apotheosis on, then you swap it to life, and you get a bonus effect along with Apotheosis. One of these 2 turns, hopefully you get a good roll on the magic dice, and you're able to get like a 9 or 10 dice phase here, because these are the 2 turns that you're going to really have a chance to throw Fiery Convocation on that horde of Savage Orcs, or Saurus or Halberdiers or whatever else. And that is definitely a one-time only spell, because it goes off on a 19 and it remains in play. So it's really just to throw it there, and then if they want to waste a magic phase to dispel it, good on them, but you're really not going to want to cast that a second time. Okay, and then the third and fourth magic phase, around the third or fourth magic phase, you should have 3 or 4 spells from the target lore that you have that you picked. This is when you really don't want to be casting high magic spells just to swap them anymore. Like, you might cast Tempest without a really good target just to swap it. Same thing with Hand of Glory. This is really, you don't want to be doing that anymore unless you absolutely have just spare dice with nothing better to do with them. Because this is the mid-game, this is where it's really important that you get those good magic phases where every spell you cast is really useful. One thing to keep in mind is, once you have that really important spell that you picked, you could branch out and start picking different lores. Like, let's say you picked Lore of Life, and then the first 2 spells you swapped, you got Regrowth and Flesh to Stone. You could keep swapping spells to it and try and pick up the other ones, but you don't really need anything other than Flesh to Stone and Regrowth. So this is where you can really start branching out into extra lores if you, for some reason, have a bunch of spare spells that you've swapped. But definitely don't prioritize that. It's easier to get good spells out of a lore that you already have spells in, because, Lore of Light's a really good example. I switched to Lore of Light, get Speed of Light my first spell. That's great. But now if I switch to Lore of Light, I could get Net, I could get Baronas, and if I roll a 2, then I can pick whatever spell I want, because I already have a spell in that lore. So it is easier to get the spells you want in lores that you already know spells in currently, so like lores you've already swapped to. And also at this point, you're going to really want to be focusing on casting buffs and hexes. So that's why those 4 lures that you really want to be swapping to are such good choices, because they're very buff and hex heavy. The last couple magic phases, like 5, 6, maybe 4, you want to continue focusing on the buffs and hexes. And then if you have any spare dice, like you just didn't have any extra units to buff, or that you've really wiped out the enemy, you want to use your spare dice to mop up like chaff units that are left, or units that ran away or whatever. And Soul Quench is actually really, really, really good at clearing out some chaff units. Okay, next I'm going to go through how I see each one of the 8 spells in high magic and what I usually use them for, and what ones I think are easily swappable without too much trouble. First up, we have the 2 signatures, Drain Magic and Soul Quench. Drain Magic's a tricky one. I almost never have casted it against certain armies that are very heavy in buff reliance, like honestly Lizardmen, Dark Elves, Beastmen, things like that. New Wood Elves especially. Drain Magic is really nice to shut down their buffs and hexes. The problem is that against any army that's ever even worth casting once, it's going to be worth saving for their next magic phase. So this is never going to be a spell you swap. It's always going to be either you use it to help shut down their magic, or you never have a target to cast it. So that's not really a candidate for swapping other spells. Okay, Soul Quench is a really, really good chaff clearing spell. It's nice and cheap for how much damage it does. This is one I would like to keep. I would always try and keep around to the end of the game for cleanup if I could. But if I'm on turn 2 or 3 and I've only gotten a swap or 2 through, or like if I have a magic phase and Soul Quench is like the only thing I was able to get off, or even if I get Soul Quench off and then he hasn't used any of his dispel dice yet, etc. I'm going to swap Soul Quench just so that I can get more swaps. So it's one of those situationally swap it, like swap it if you need to, because you do want to swap about 4 spells per game. That's like your goal at least. So you can get your 1 Sig and then 3 and whatever the target lore is. But this is a handy spell to keep around if you're fighting something with a lot of chaff, like Wood Elves or something. Okay, Apotheosis is one that, like I said, I would always swap to Lore of Life. If I ever have a reason to use Apotheosis, and I think I'm going to need heals later on in the game, I won't keep Apotheosis, I'll swap it to Life, so that I can get, +2 toughness and the heal, or extra models and the heal, or, whatever else, just because they'll have the same effect as the unboosted Apotheosis, but with their other effect, which is better than boosting Apotheosis in my mind. Hand of Glory is a decent initiative buff, especially if you have a Bastillodon running around, but the best use that I've found is to boost a ballistic skill of an Ancient Stegodon, so you can actually, be hitting on 5s or something instead of 7s, which you're often hitting on with the Ancient. This one's a really good one to swap if your target lore is light, because the Ancient Steg's going to be getting in combat pretty quickly, and so you won't be able to get advantage of that ballistic skill buff anymore, and light has better initiative and weapon skill buffs than Hand of Glory. Next up we have Walk Between Worlds, and this is an absolutely outstanding spell for Lizardmen, especially now that Salamanders can't march and shoot. I always throw this first turn on a Salamander that I had not marched to get it into position and shoot first turn. The other really good use is on a Cold One bus or on a Stegodon to set it up for a flank charge. And this one requires the most foresight into the game to know whether you'll be able to afford to swap it or not. Because while you can definitely get use out of it first turn, and it's hard to see future use for it, You might want it, turn 4 to set up that flank or rear charge or whatever, especially if you're fighting a very combat-oriented army and have some really good flankers yourself. I often do swap this just because I'm not very good at using it for that kind of tactical positioning. But this is definitely the hardest to decide spell in the lore, whether you want to swap it or not. And right after it, we have the easiest lore spell to decide. Tempest is definitely a free swap. It's basically you roll the dice to get the swap, and the effect is just a bonus. There's two different ways to use Tempest mainly. One is to throw it on a shooting unit and try and shut down their shooting a little bit. And then the other one is to throw it on a unit that won't take very many, if any, casualties at all. Simply because if you throw a spell turn 1, in Tempest you always want to cast turn 1. This is where my first 3 dice go turn 1 every time. But if you throw this spell that does strength 3 hits against, Demigryph Knights, where they're toughness 4 with 1-up armors, no one is going to dispel that, because it's going to do maybe a wound if you're extremely lucky. And you get the free swap. So it's a guaranteed spell swap, turn 1, every time. So that's mainly what I use it for, is I just throw it on somewhere that might take something from it, and hope that they don't dispel it so that I can get the swap. Next is Arcane and Forging. This one I use to either destroy an item or take a wound and an item off some well-protected character. It's nice to throw at Scroll Caddies or Hellheart Caddies or something like that, so that they can't use that scroll on you, when you cast Fiery Convocation later or something. The other nice use is to knock a ward save off the BSB so that you can Spirit Leech him, or off the General, or, the fighty Vampire Lord, getting rid of his Ochre Blade or whatever. Things like that. It's nice to just throw at a character that has a couple good items, or just one, item that you're specifically targeting. And if it wounds him, yay. If it blows up the item, yay. But either way, there's a spell swap right there. It's always really funny throwing this at Scroll Caddies, because people have to decide whether to let it go through or use the scroll on it, and it seems like such a waste of a spell to scroll. So it really can mess with your opponent's head trying to do that. And then finally we have Fiery Convocation. This one is a turn 2 or 3, take a horde of infantry, throw 6 dice at it, and they'll either pick up the unit or give you an entire free magic phase. Both of which are worth 19 to cast, no questions asked. The one downside of the spell is you're going to have to use most of your dice in one turn to cast it, but it is definitely a free swap, and it is definitely worth casting, especially on, big hordes of expensive stuff like, 50 halberdiers and a couple characters, the horde of savage orcs, a block of 30 Saurus would hate this, things along those lines. I really like casting the spell on Plague Bearers, because Plague Bearers are such a bitch to kill in combat, and this does knock their regen down to just their 5 up ward. It's a really, really nice spell. You just got to make sure that you have the dice to cast it turn 2 or 3. If you have your Forbidden Rod in your army, this is a really good turn to earn spells to use to cast with those dice. Okay, here's just a couple examples of how you should be thinking about armies. Like, for example, a matchup that I have quite often is my Source Heavy army versus demons. So the signature spell that I'd go for, I'd roll 1 on death. If I get Doom and Darkness, keep it, so that I can, try and cause some demonic instabilities to fail harder. And if I don't get Dim Darkness, swap for Spirit Leech and try and suck out the BSB and the Greater Demon Souls and stuff. And then target lore is Light, because Light is both the best buff for Source Heavy and has Banishment, which is outstanding against demons. With the 3d6 Strength 4 and they have to reroll Armor save. Banishment is unbelievably good against demons. On top of that, unlike ASF armies where the initiative and ASF buffs are just gonna, make you tie them and get rid of their rerolls or something, this one will let you go first because demons, don't have ASF. That being said, getting Barona's Time Warp against any Elven army is awesome because it makes you go simultaneously with them, and as well as that gets rid of their rerolls to hit, which causes their infantry to be a lot worse than their points are worth. Next up is pretty much any Lizardmen build versus an Undead or Skaven army. Your first thought would be to grab Spirit Leech as your signature, but against any of those three armies, you really want Death as your main lore. Because the two Undead armies are really low initiative, so Purple Sun's great. They're really character-centered, so you really want several, of the three sniping spells. And then against, like Vampire Counts, you'd want Metal as your signature to help deal with the Black Knight bus. Against Skaven, you'd want Shadow to lower their initiative for Purple Sun. You want to pick a different signature. But against all three of these, you'd probably want Death as your main one. Next one would be like a Skink Cloud versus an Empire army. And so you'd want to grab Metal to help deal with all the, Inner Circle Knights and Demigriffs and the Steam Tank and crap that Empire have. And you could, Enchanted Blades would help boost your Skinks quite a bit. And then for the signature, you'd want to grab Ice Shard Blizzard to shut down Hellblasters. Because Hellblasters will annihilate Skink armies. And that Ice Shard can give you time to get your Skinks over there and poison it down. And this is an example of another one where when you're looking at the signature, your first thought is, Searing Doom, the Steam Tank. But, yeah, while you want Searing Doom, you also want the rest of the lore of Metal. So you really have to... maybe I described that backwards. Maybe you should pick your lore that you want first, and then look at what signature you want to complement that lore against the particular army you're fighting. Alright. Okay, so that about wraps up my Tactica on how to use Lore of High Magic properly. If you have any other questions or you think that I got something wrong, please leave a comment in the bottom. And just before we wrap up here's the key points you really want to keep in mind if you're using Lore Master High Magic, and you never take High Magic without Lore Master. That's the whole point of it. First off, you want to focus on what lore you're swapping to, so you can, design a good battle strategy around that one lore. You have to think ahead, you have to plan for your next turn, and know what spells you're not going to need again. And then you really want to hold back on it. You don't want to just keep focusing on swapping all the way through to turn 6, because there gets to be a point where you just need to focus on getting good magic off and not worry about swapping to the most useful spells anymore. I have made that mistake before, and it really ends up hurting you. Okay, so that about wraps it up, and I'll see you next time.